In the silence of the library, her whisper wasn't just a command, it was an invitation into a secret I never expected to share. The library had always been my refuge. Most people I knew came here only when they needed to cram for an exam or chase a deadline, but for me, it was something different. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the world grow softer, the chaos of everything beyond the heavy wooden doors giving way to a kind of stillness I couldn't find anywhere else. The smell of paper, ink fading with time, leather spines warmed by the sun, was grounding. It reminded me that even in a world rushing forward, some things remain patient. That's when I noticed her. The librarian. She wasn't just another figure behind the desk, stamping due dates into borrowed books. She carried herself with a grace that made the entire room seem to slow down around her. Her movements were measured, deliberate, yet unhurried, as if she respected the silence that wrapped itself around the shelves. Her hair, pulled back loosely, caught the light whenever she tilted her head, and though her face wore the calm composure of someone used to being observed but never truly seen, there was something in her eyes, something quietly alive. I had seen her before, of course, but never like this. Not until today, when I approached the desk and asked for a book I hadn't been able to find. She lifted her gaze to me, and for a moment, it felt as though her eyes could read not only my request but something deeper I hadn't spoken aloud. "Which one?" she asked softly, her voice low but carrying just enough weight to hush the stray whispers around us. When I told her, she didn't simply point me in the right direction. Instead, she stood, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with an absent hand, and walked around the desk. Her heels clicked lightly against the polished floor, a sound that was subtle yet impossible not to notice. I followed her through the tall shelves, watching as she scanned the spines with an ease that betrayed years of familiarity. And then it happened, a fleeting moment, small enough to be overlooked by anyone else, but not me. She reached for the book, sliding it from the shelf, and as she turned to hand it to me, our fingers nearly brushed. The leather cover pressed against my palm at the same instant her sleeve brushed against the back of my hand. It wasn't deliberate, but it lingered in my senses as if it had been. Her perfume was faint, a warm, woodsy note, like sandalwood softened by something floral, and it mixed with the scent of the book itself until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Here," she said gently, placing the book into my hands. Her voice held no more than a whisper, but it carried through me as if the entire library had fallen quiet just to let me hear it. I stayed longer than I needed to. The book she had found for me rested in my hands, but I wasn't really reading. I kept glancing over the top of the pages, pretending to study the words, while my focus betrayed me, drifting again and again toward her. She moved behind the desk with the same graceful composure, sliding books into their places, guiding visitors in low tones. Every so often, her eyes lifted, never quite long enough to be certain she was looking at me, but long enough for my heart to question it. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining the tension. But when the library thinned out, the air growing still with the absence of chatter, I felt it, a shift. She walked out from behind the desk, her steps soft but purposeful, and I knew instantly she was heading toward me. I pretended to keep reading, though my pulse betrayed me. She stopped at the end of the row, her figure half lit by the pale glow of the ceiling lamps. Then she leaned closer, her voice barely audible, her lips near enough to stir the fine hairs by my ear. "Come with me, quietly." The words sank into me, weighted with more meaning than they should have carried. I nodded, almost too quickly, closing the book in my hands. She turned without waiting for an answer, and I followed. We moved together through the aisles, her presence just ahead of me, close enough to feel the air shift when her hand brushed along a shelf for balance. The stacks narrowed as we went deeper, the rows darker, quieter, like walking into a secret part of the world meant only for us. Every sound, the brush of her skirt as she walked, the faint squeak of the floor under my shoes, was magnified. At one point she slowed. The aisle was so narrow our shoulders touched, the faintest graze of fabric against fabric. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set off a spark I felt down to my ribs. I breathed in, catching again that warm, woodsy note of her perfume mingled with the must of old paper. She stopped in front of a section I'd never noticed before, her fingers trailing lightly along the spines. She tilted her head toward me, her hair brushing my arm as she whispered, "Few people come back here." Her words were simple, almost practical, but the softness of her tone made them feel like a confession. My chest tightened. I wanted to answer, to say something clever, but the silence seemed sacred, and I didn't dare break it. Instead, I watched as she pulled a book free, her sleeve brushing against me again. When she turned, our faces were only a breath apart, her eyes lifting to meet mine. There was no laughter in them, no trace of casual professionalism, only a quiet intensity that made me forget where we were. I swallowed, my voice caught somewhere between hesitation and longing. She didn't stop in the narrow aisle for long. With the book still in her hand, she gave me a glance, the kind that says more than words ever could, and then continued walking. I followed without question, my steps quiet, though I felt every beat of my heart echoing in my ears. At the far end of the stacks, she pushed open a small wooden door I hadn't noticed before. It creaked softly, revealing a tucked-away nook, 2 armchairs angled toward a low table, a single lamp glowing amber, and shelves crowding in like protective walls. It felt more like someone's private study than part of a public library. "Sit," she whispered, gesturing lightly toward one of the chairs. I obeyed, sinking into the worn cushions, still trying to process how I'd ended up here with her, alone, out of sight, where even the faint hum of the library seemed distant. She placed the book on the table, then lowered herself into the chair opposite mine. Her posture was straight at first, composed as always, but then she leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on her knees. The lamplight softened her face, catching the curve of her cheek, the gentle seriousness in her eyes. "Why do you come here so often?" she asked. Her voice wasn't accusing, it was curious, like she truly wanted to know. I hesitated, glancing down at my hands. Most people never asked me questions like that, not with the patience to hear the truth. "I guess," I started slowly, "it's the one place where everything feels quiet. Safe. Like the world slows down, and I can finally hear myself think." I hadn't meant to sound so open, but the words spilled out easier than I expected. Maybe it was the way she listened, her head tilted just slightly, her eyes steady on me, as though every syllable mattered. For a moment she said nothing, and I wondered if I'd said too much. Then her expression softened. "I know what you mean," she murmured. "That's why I never left. The quiet, it holds you, doesn't it? But sometimes," she paused, her gaze dropping to her hands, "it can be lonely, too." The vulnerability in her words startled me. I hadn't expected someone like her, graceful, composed, admired by everyone who walked through those doors, to confess to loneliness. I wanted to reach across the table, to close the distance between us, but instead I shifted, and in that small movement our knees brushed under the table. It was nothing, a light touch, but neither of us pulled away. I swallowed, my voice quieter now. "It doesn't feel lonely right now." Her eyes lifted, meeting mine again. There was a flicker there, a softness mixed with something deeper, something unspoken. Her lips parted as though she might answer, but she didn't. Instead, she let the silence stretch between us, not uncomfortable but charged, filled with everything we weren't saying. In that hidden corner, surrounded by books and shadows, it felt as though we had stepped outside of time itself, into a place where the world couldn't see us, and where, for the first time, I was beginning to truly see her. For a while, we didn't speak. She had picked up the book she'd carried into the nook, and opened it, her eyes scanning the page with quiet concentration. I mirrored her, flipping through my own book, though I couldn't have repeated a single line of what I'd read. My mind wasn't on the words, it was on her. There was something oddly intimate about the silence. Not the usual library hush, where strangers politely avoided disturbing one another, but something warmer. This was a silence shared, chosen. It was as though the small lamp between us created a bubble of stillness, where every small sound, the soft turn of a page, the faint clearing of a throat, meant something more. I risked a glance at her. She had leaned back into her chair now, one leg crossed neatly over the other, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the book. The lamplight painted a golden outline along her jaw, catching the curve of her lips. She tilted her head slightly, a small smile flickering when she reached a line she liked. It was such a simple thing, yet it made her look almost vulnerable, like the weight she usually carried slipped away when she was lost in words. I felt my chest tighten, a quiet longing pressing against my ribs. At one point, she reached up to adjust her glasses, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The motion was unremarkable, ordinary even, but the way her eyes briefly lifted to mine as she did it made the air between us ripple. I quickly looked down at my page, pretending to read, but my heart was beating faster than before. The space between our chairs was narrow, our arms resting close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Every time I shifted slightly, my sleeve brushed against hers. Neither of us moved back. It was as though we both understood that this proximity, fragile as it was, mattered. Eventually, she lowered her book onto her lap and studied me openly, her expression thoughtful. "You really do read?" she said softly, almost like she was surprised. I gave a nervous smile. "Most of the time. Tonight, maybe less so." Her lips curved just a little, and for a second, her gaze lingered as if she wanted to say something more but decided against it. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table again, and the movement brought her just close enough that the faint brush of her sleeve grazed my arm. The contact was nothing more than fabric on fabric, yet it felt heavier than it should have, like the soft weight of silence itself pressing us together. We stayed that way, suspended in something unspoken, until the clock on the far wall ticked, reminding us that time hadn't truly stopped. But in that moment, I wished it had. Because in that quiet, in that closeness, I felt a peace I hadn't known I was searching for. The evening crept in slowly. Beyond the tall windows, the sky faded from pale blue to deep indigo, and the lamps around the library dimmed one by one, leaving only scattered pools of golden light. Most of the patrons had already left. Their footsteps had faded into the night. It felt as though the library belonged only to us now, as though the walls themselves had drawn closer, keeping our little corner safe. She closed her book and rested it on the table, her fingers tapping lightly against the cover. Her gaze lingered on the lamp for a moment, then shifted toward me. I felt her eyes before I dared to look up. "You notice things," she said softly. The words caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Her lips curved, but it wasn't quite a smile. "Most people come here for what they need, a book, a quiet hour. They hardly look at me, not really. But you see things. The way you look, the way you listen." She paused, her voice lowering, almost hesitant. "Sometimes it feels like you see me more than you should." Her words lingered between us like the faint dust hanging in the light. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the heat in my chest. I could have laughed it off, pretended it wasn't true. But something in her expression, that quiet vulnerability beneath her steady composure, urged me to be honest. "I do notice," I admitted. My voice was lower than I expected, unsteady. "I notice how the room feels different when you're here. How you make silence feel alive, not empty. I notice the way you touch the books like they're old friends. And I notice," I hesitated, feeling my pulse in my throat, "that you make me want to stay, even when I should leave." For a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes searched mine, deep and unreadable. Then she exhaled softly, as though she had been holding her breath. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. But her tone lacked conviction. It was less a warning and more a confession of her own weakness. The table between us suddenly felt too wide. I shifted closer, my hand resting on the wood just inches from hers. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile, until she made the smallest of movements, her hand sliding over mine, her fingertips grazing the back of my knuckles. The touch was feather-light, but it carried the weight of something unspoken, something both of us had been circling all evening. My chest tightened, not with fear but with the raw intensity of wanting more. Slowly I turned my hand, letting her fingers slip into my palm. Her hand was warm, steady, but I could feel a faint tremor, or maybe it was my own. She didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the moment to linger, her thumb brushing faintly against my skin. Her eyes softened, but I could still see the hesitation there, the question of whether this was right, or dangerous, or both. Yet in that low light, with the hush of the library folding around us, the library had fallen completely silent. No distant shuffling of feet, no murmured voices from the other side of the shelves, only the hum of the old lamps and the steady ticking of the clock high on the wall. She glanced toward the entrance, as though checking if anyone might wander in, and then her eyes returned to me. "It's late," she murmured, her hands slowly slipping from mine. But even as she said it, she didn't move to stand. Her fingers lingered a moment longer, as though reluctant to break the fragile thread tying us together. Finally, she rose, smoothing the fabric of her skirt with practiced composure. "Come," she said gently, her voice softer now, almost tired. I followed her without a word as she walked through the quiet aisles, her figure a shadow against the dim light. We reached the main hallway where tall windows looked out into the night. The lamps here were fewer, their glow stretched thin against the dark, casting long, delicate shadows across the floor. She stopped in front of the doors, her hand resting on the brass handle, but she didn't push it open. Instead, she turned to face me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was different now, heavier, charged, like a held breath waiting to be released. Her eyes studied mine with a kind of intensity one hadn't seen before, as if she were searching for the strength to say something, or the permission not to. I stepped closer, unable to resist the pull. I didn't plan it, didn't think, it was as natural as breathing. Soon, the distance between us was barely more than an inch, her breath brushing against my cheek. My chest tightened as I felt the warmth of her presence, the faint tremor of tension running between us. Her eyes lowered briefly to my lips, then back to my eyes. The movement was small, fleeting, but enough to make my pulse quicken. I leaned in slightly, not enough to close the space, but enough to let her know I wanted to. Her hand lifted, hesitantly at first, then with quiet resolve. She cupped my cheek, her palm warm, her thumb brushing gently across my skin. The touch was tender, almost reverent, and I found myself leaning into it without meaning to. We stood there, suspended, her lips so close that I could feel the faint whisper of her breath, the world narrowing to just that one moment. My heart begged for more, to bridge the distance, to step into the promise of something inevitable. But then she exhaled, her forehead leaning briefly against mine, her voice a whisper that trembled with restraint. "Not here." The words stung and soothed at the same time. A denial, yet not rejection. A promise deferred. I nodded slowly, letting the silence say the rest. I didn't move away, not yet. I let myself memorize the warmth of her hand, the weight of her presence, the ache of almost having what I wanted. When she finally stepped back, her hand lingered against my face for one last moment before falling to her side. The library door creaked as she unlocked it, the cool night air rushing in to meet us. The night greeted us with a cool breath, the kind that carries the faint scent of rain even when the sky is clear. Street lamps lined the quiet road outside the library, their light falling in pale circles on the empty pavement. For a moment neither of us moved. The heavy wooden doors closed softly behind us, shutting away the stillness of the library, leaving only the quiet hum of the town at rest. She stood a step ahead of me, her hand still on the iron railing by the entrance. Her gaze was distant, fixed somewhere down the street, but her body remained angled just slightly toward me. I could see it in her posture, the hesitation, the weight of everything unspoken. I wanted to say something, to break the fragile silence, but the words tangled in my chest. Instead, I took a step closer. The sound of my shoes against the stone made her glance up at me, her eyes softening the moment they met mine. There was no stern librarian composure now. No guarded expression, no carefully measured tone. She looked simply human. And in that humanity, there was warmth. "You should go," she whispered, though even she didn't sound convinced. "Do you want me to?" I asked quietly. Her lips parted, then pressed together again. She shook her head, just faintly, and in that small motion, the air between us shifted. She reached out, hesitantly at first, her hand brushing against mine. The contact was light, almost tentative, but when I turned my palm upward to hold her fingers, she didn't resist. Her hand was warm against the cool night. She gave it the gentlest squeeze, as though testing the reality of what we had begun. My thumb brushed over the back of her hand, slow and steady, and I felt her shoulders relax, the tension she carried all day slipping away, just for this moment. "Tomorrow?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost to the whisper of the breeze. I smiled, a real smile, the kind that rose from somewhere deeper than words. "Tomorrow," I promised. Her eyes lingered on mine, as though she wanted to memorize the shape of my answer. Then she let out a breath she'd been holding, and for a fleeting moment, she leaned just slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine. Not an embrace, not a kiss, but something that carried the same quiet weight. A promise wrapped in restraint. We stood like that beneath the glow of the street lamps, two figures framed in a silence that was no longer empty but alive with possibility. Around us, the town slept, but for us, the night had only just begun. When at last we parted, her hand slipped from mine slowly, reluctantly, like a bookmark being placed between the pages of a story that wasn't finished yet. She gave one last look, a glance that was half smile, half confession, before turning down the street.